With that, let's now shift focus over to the United States. In a significant step towards de-escalation, Russian President Vladimir Putin has agreed to a limited ceasefire, halting attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure following a high-stakes phone call with US President Donald Trump. However, the Russian leader stopped short of committing to a broader ceasefire, tempering hopes for a swift end to these hostilities. What happens next? Find out.
A highly anticipated phone call between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin ended with a limited agreement for Russia to halt strikes against energy infrastructure in Ukraine, which Kyiv quickly said it would be willing to consider. The Kremlin said Putin ordered the Russian military to halt the strikes against energy facilities in Ukraine. But Putin stopped short of accepting a broader U.S.-backed 30-day ceasefire that Ukraine has said it is ready to accept. In a statement after Tuesday's call, the White House said, quote, "The leaders agreed that the movement to peace will begin with an energy and infrastructure ceasefire, as well as technical negotiations on implementation of a maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea, full ceasefire, and permanent peace." The Kremlin said Putin had raised concerns about a truce being used by Ukraine to mobilize more soldiers and rearm itself. Putin also said that any resolution of the conflict would require an end to all military and intelligence assistance to Ukraine. Later, Trump said on Truth Social that the call was productive, with an understanding that the leaders will be, quote, "working quickly to have a complete ceasefire and ultimately an end to the war." Trump's overtures to Putin since returning to the White House have left traditional U.S. allies wary. Ukraine and its Western allies have long described Russia's invasion as an imperialist land grab, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has accused Putin of deliberately prolonging the war. After Tuesday's call, the Kremlin said that Russia and Ukraine would conduct another prisoner exchange on Wednesday, trading 175 people from each side.
Now remember, US President Donald Trump and his Ukrainian counterpart Volodymyr Zelensky have in fact held an hour-long call weeks after a fiery exchange at the White House that dashed hopes of Washington playing peace broker between Russia and Kyiv. But how did this phone call in fact shape up? Let's find out in our next report.
Freed Ukrainian prisoners of war celebrated on Wednesday after Russia and Ukraine each agreed to release 175 captured troops. Moscow said it freed an additional 22 wounded Ukrainians as a goodwill gesture, following a phone call between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. But just hours after that call, in which a deal was reached to pause attacks on energy infrastructure, both Russia and Ukraine accused each other of violating the new agreement. Moscow said Ukraine hit an oil depot in southern Russia, while Kyiv said Russia had struck hospitals and homes and knocked out power to some of its railways. This all came on the same day that Trump had a phone call with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky that Trump described as very good. Before their conversation, Zelensky said Moscow's continued attacks showed its words did not match its actions, and that Russia was not ready for peace. He also said that the United States should be in charge of monitoring any ceasefire.
You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel.
The hour-long call on Wednesday between Trump and Zelensky was their first conversation since an Oval Office meeting descended into a shouting match in late February.
Intelligence sharing in terms of defense for Ukraine will continue to be shared.
Later, White House spokesperson Caroline Leavitt said Zelensky asked Trump for additional air defense support, and that Trump said he would help locate the equipment in Europe. She also said Trump has moved beyond a previously negotiated U.S.-Ukraine minerals deal.
We've moved beyond just the economic minerals deal framework, and we're looking at a lasting ceasefire. Right now, we're at a partial ceasefire. But again, the president is sending his highly skilled, intelligent, and experienced team to Saudi Arabia later this week to continue fighting for peace in this conflict.
Trump has long promised to end Europe's deadliest conflict since World War II. But his outreach to Putin has unnerved European allies, who fear it heralds a fundamental shift after 80 years in which defending Europe from Russian expansionism was the core mission of U.S. foreign policy.
We do now have simultaneous and conflicting streams of talks aimed at bringing some sort of peace to Ukraine, and we're talking about conflict between the EU and the US. EU leaders met in Brussels on Thursday to work out, as they intend, a workable European response, and together with that, defense chiefs from these countries met in London to work out the nuts and bolts of such a response, and that meeting took place behind closed doors. At Brussels, EU member countries other than Hungary agreed, and they declared in a statement that the EU needs to step up efforts to address Ukraine's pressing military and defense needs so that Europe steps in militarily where the US cannot be counted on to do so anymore. And this meeting really has just widened the rift between Europe and the US. Putin, on the other hand, has been looking for demilitarization of Ukraine, and he's been seeking that with some varying signs of Trump support. Putin is emphatic that there cannot be ceasefire unless there's an end to what he calls Western military support to Ukraine, but it is now an increasingly more divided West. It's not the West anymore. The only result so far from all these talks is the agreement between Trump and Putin for Ukraine and Russia to stop attacking one another's energy structure and infrastructure, but that agreement we've seen has been broken from both sides on day one. But really now on the ground, Ukraine is very much on the back foot. It's losing heavily in Kursk and right along the east. Ukraine certainly believes that its future seems to rest more on what Europe is prepared to do for its defense rather than what the US might do, and certainly is not counting on Putin to just stop.